A few weeks ago we read 2 chapters. I'm going to read 1 chapter this week, but I want to read to you from Acts 27. It's Paul's boat trip to Rome, and it is the storm and the shipwreck. And it is the next chapter to what we've been reading. How could you plan this? You couldn't do it. You just could not do it. We have been ploughing through Acts for weeks, doing Paul said this, Paul did that. And then the meta-narrative of this story is that through all the storms of life, God gets you through. Yeah. But I just think it's an absolute miracle that it should have turned up now and we're not even a chapter out. I mean, I've been tempted to jump on a chapter, but this is the word of God. He says, Alastair, I've got the word for you. You don't have to go and find one. They start the journey anyway, and we'll pick it up at 7. Acts 27:7. We, and a lot of this is written in we, and Luke feels the whole thing, you know. We sailed slowly for several days and with great difficulty, finally arrived off the town of Cnidus. The wind would not let us go any further in that direction, so we sailed down the sheltered side of the island of Crete, passing by Cape Salomon. We kept close to the coast and with great difficulty came to the place called Safe Harbours, not far from the town of Lasea. We spent a long time there until it became dangerous to continue the voyage. For now it was near to the Day of Atonement. So Paul gave them this advice. Men, I see that our voyage from here on will be dangerous. There will be great damage to the cargo and to the ship, and loss of life as well. But the army officer was convinced by what the captain and the owner of the ship said, and not by what Paul said. The harbour was not a good one to spend a winter in, so most people were in favour of putting out to sea and trying to reach Phoenix, if possible, in order to spend a winter there. Phoenix is a harbour in Crete that faces southwest and northwest. A soft wind from the south began to blow, and the men thought that they could carry out their plan, so they pulled up the anchor and sailed as close as possible along the coast of Crete. But soon a very strong wind, the one called the northeaster, blew down from the island. It hit the ship, and since it was impossible to keep the ship headed into the wind, we gave up trying and let it be carried along by the wind. We got some shelter when we passed to the south of the little island of Cauda. There, with some difficulty, we managed to make the ship's boat secure. They pulled it aboard and then fastened some ropes tight round the ship. They were afraid that they might run into the sandbanks off the coast of Libya, so they lowered the sail and let the ship be carried by the wind. And the violent storm continued. So on the next day they began to throw some of the ship's cargo overboard. And on the following day they threw part of the ship's equipment overboard. And for many days we could not see the sun or the stars, and the wind kept on blowing very hard. And we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After those on board had gone a long time without any food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have listened to me and not sailed from Crete. Then we would have avoided all this damage and loss. But now I beg you, take heart. Not one of you will lose your life. Only the ship will be lost. For last night an angel of God to whom I belong and whom I worship came to me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor. And God in his goodness to you has spared the lives of all those who are sailing with you. So take heart, men, for I trust in God that it will be just as I was told, but we will be driven ashore on some island.' It was the 14th night, and we were being driven about in the Mediterranean by the storm. About midnight, the sailors suspected that we were getting close to land, so they dropped a line with a weight tied to it and found that the water was 40 meters deep. A little later, they did the same and found that it was 30 meters deep. they were afraid that the ship would go on the rocks. So they lowered 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight. Then the sailors tried to escape from the ship, and they lowered the boat into the water and pretended that they were going to put out some anchors from the front of the ship. But Paul said to the army officer and the soldiers, "If the sailors do not stay on board, you have no hope of being saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the boat and let it go. And just before dawn, Paul begged them all to eat some food. "You have been waiting for 14 days now, and all this time you have not eaten anything. I beg you then, eat some food. You need it in order to survive. Not even a hair of your heads will be lost." And after saying this, Paul took some bread, gave thanks to God before them all, broke it and began to eat. And they took heart, and every one of them also ate some food. And there were a total of 276 of us on board. And after everyone had eaten enough, they lightened the ship by throwing all the wheat into the sea. When day came, the sailors did not recognize the coast, but they noticed a bay with a beach and decided that, if possible, they would run the ship again aground there. So they cut off the anchors and let them sink into the sea, and at the same time they untied the ropes that held the steering oars. Then they raised the sail at the front and the ship so that the wind would blow the ship forward, and we headed for the shore. But the ship hit a sandbank and went aground. The front part of the ship got stuck and could not move, while the back part was being broken to pieces by the violence of the waves. And the soldiers made a plan to kill all the prisoners in order to keep them from swimming ashore and escaping. But the army officer wanted to save Paul, so he stopped them from doing this. Instead, he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and swim ashore, and the rest were to follow, holding on to the planks or to some broken pieces of the ship. And this was how we all got safely ashore. Wow. What a great passage. What drama that is, isn't it? Tremendous. Paul just had a little bit of video for us here about serious storms. Storms are not pretty waves on the cliffs of Cornwall, which everybody takes pictures of, or just break over the beach. It's kind of that sort of storm. In a first century boat, which is at best square rigged and won't sit close to the wind at all. This is a great meta-narrative, isn't it, for us? I just can't deal with all of that in detail. But if the message of God is that God gets you through the storms of life, this passage gives us a great analysis to start off with of the problems that we have with storms and the problems that we are having as a community with this storm at the moment, with this virus. But it applies to all the other sorts of storms as well. The sort of storms that we involve with what we call people who are ordinarily ill at the moment and dangerously ill anyway. The storms we might have in our relationships, in our marriages or our families. The storms we have economically with our business and all that sort of thing. The storms we have internally with anxiety and fears. They are all storms. This is the meta-narrative for all of them. The wind blows and God gets us through. But you see how it develops in this. It gives a great picture of how things get worse and worse in all these kinds of storms, you see. It starts off with calm winds. And then you find that they cannot hold their course. So there's going to be a delay. They go south towards Crete. It's no big deal. It's irritating. And then the wind gets worse. And they have to give way altogether and sail out into the Mediterranean. And it gets worse and worse. And then they get a bit of leeway under a small island, and then they lift in the boat. And then they frap it by putting ropes around it so it doesn't fall to pieces. In this period, you can feel that the passengers are thinking, first of all, this is an inconvenience. Secondly, we are becoming seasick here. Thirdly, we are getting wet. But they're also thinking, we have sailors on here. This should be okay. They're doing sailorly sort of things with ropes and boats, and that's fine. We'll be okay. And anyway, we have an imperial presence here. That's going to be fine, isn't it? And then, it's not fine, is it? Then they start throwing things over the side, and they think, this is getting serious. And then they start throwing the cargo over the side, and they think, this is not funny, is it? And that sense of, we are losing this. The experts are not coping. They're not managing. We don't know where they are. It's a bad storm. At night, there is no navigation because there's no stars and there's no moon. We could be anywhere. And a boat without its cargo is just like a cork on the sea. Just terrible. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. And there is this sense of loss of control. The Romans should do something. The owners should do something. The sailors should do something. And when it comes to let's get the cargo off, will everybody help? You know how it'll be. Everybody will help in this situation. Everybody will do everything that anybody can. But it is not enough. And we had lost, Luke says, and Luke is a fairly laconic Greek doctor. We had all lost hope. This is a great analysis of where we are in our community at the moment. How people feel we are. We're nowhere near that. But this sense of, it's going to be all right. We are a sophisticated society. We can deal with this. We can deal with that. We have the NHS. We have all the science. We have all the resources. They'll be okay. They'll be okay. And it slowly slips downhill. And we might not be able to cope. We might not be able to go. We might not be able to go. Boris can't cope. It's like this, isn't it? And people just start, and the media who like this kind of thing just stoke it right up. We are not where they were. But a lot of people have the feeling that we are where they were. And that's what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with facts at the moment. We're dealing with feelings. But that's the same as well when I've been with a family whose loved one is in their last few hours. They have done everything. The medics have done everything. All the kit is there. But the family have done everything. The place is full of flowers and fruit and love. They have done everything. But it was not enough. There is no more than we can do. And you see the same thing played out in some of these little cafes and coffee shops in Penzance that come up and go down. They start with a new idea. They are bright and breezy. It's really good. And then you feel that nobody's going in there. And then they have new ideas and new offers. And they do everything. They have candles. They have flowers. They have amazing sandwiches. And then they've done everything. Then they close. It's the same thing. It's the loss of nobody will come. We can't do any more. And sometimes internally as well, where we are suffering from sign of anxiety or depression, not necessarily clinical depression, but we are just deeply dark in ourselves and fearful or guilty or something, we will do everything we can. We will read the right books, talk to the right people, drink the right coffee, think thoughts, do things, look at sunsets. We'll do it all. We've done everything. But it doesn't work. And we think, what do we say? I'm not holding this together. Just like the boat, really. I've done all the rope stuff. I'm not holding it. You see, it's such a good scenario here for where we are. So, what then? What then does God do? Well, he works through Paul. You wonder sometimes with Paul whether you want him on the boat or not, don't you? That great speech where he stands up and says, you should have listened to me when we were in Crete, But he's a great man, isn't he? But the great thing about Paul, and this is where we need to model it as disciples of Jesus, really distinctively. The great thing about Paul is that back a few chapters in Acts 23, so a few weeks before, you remember that he had a vision from God who said, do not be afraid. You have given your witness for me here in Jerusalem, and you must also do the same in Rome. So he is not going to drown. his contact with the Lord, his faith with the Lord, means that he already knows that God will bring him through. He doesn't know he's going to bring anything else through, the boat through, or the crew through. He says, you could lose loss of life and the cargo, and it's dangerous. But what determines everything is his knowledge that God will bring him through. This is the touchstone of all of our attitudes to all of these storms, whether it's your private storm or whether it's us standing in this national storm. God will bring us through. And it is that determines how Paul relates to them. Because he relates well to God, he can be fully engaged with the situation. That's where the term "we're all in the same boat" comes from, isn't it? Too often Christians do not engage. I've heard of people preaching already and saying already, this is the judgment of God. We should draw up the drawbridge of Zion and let them all be destroyed. I mean, this stuff is nuts. Even if indirectly a lot of this comes from sin and greed and globalization and stupidity in using animals and other parts of the creation. But in terms of saying that, we're like people, like the church becomes like the lifeboat that all the Christians get in and sail off and leave everybody else in the boat. Paul is engaged right through this. He gets wet, he gets tired, he almost gets drowned. We are called to be integrated and engaged with our community and with our people. He's also very bright, isn't he? Because he's calm, he says, you don't want to go from Crete. It's going to be a disaster. We need to give good advice, clear advice. Not because he thinks he's going to be drowned, but because he doesn't want them to be drowned. You know? If you think you're going down, you just panic. But if you know you are firm in the Lord, you can give good words to the people around you. Whether it's just washing your hands or whatever it might be. These things, we are called in another one of Paul's letters to be model citizens. We should be bright and good. But also we should be looking at the evidence, which means there is absolutely no reason for us to panic. And he doesn't panic all the way through. But he gives them good, engaged advice. He is not sitting there just praying all the time. He's helping. He's getting involved. Because he knows what God is doing. And so when he comes to his first big speech, you can see Paul stood before them and said, men, I don't know whether they're all men, but anyway, he said, men. I suppose these days he would have said, people, you should have listened to me and not said that. But now I beg you to take heart. None of you will lose your life. Only the ship will be lost. For last night an angel of God, to whom I belong and I worship, came to me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before the emperor. And God in his goodness to you has spared the lives of all those who are sailing with you. So take heart, men. So, because he is hearing from God, he begins to intervene. He's not just with them, helping with this, helping, but he begins to stand out. We, our men and women, should begin to stand out. In fact, he offers a degree of leadership. There were the official leaders, the owner of the boat, the captain of the ship, the sailors, and the captain of the guard. But when other authorities are lacking and seem to be lacking, this is a time for Christians to take leadership. It doesn't have to make noise about it, but it can be leadership in a conversation, in a text, in your whole attitude. The church needs to take a lead. We're not people who follow. We're called to lead. And you see this leadership. He says, come on, you people, he says. I have heard from God, not only that I'm going to be saved, but you are all going to be saved. So take heart. Bit of a joke in our family that when I've been camping, or particularly trekking and walking with them, and when it's raining continuously, I am always saying, don't worry, it's just going over. You know, it could rain it has been known to rain on some of the camps I've been on for 24 hours at least. But I'm always saying, I think it's just easing off now, you know. And people used to be encouraged by that until they knew that it probably would not be. Paul is not saying that, I think it's just easing off a bit now. He says, you people, take heart. That's leadership, isn't it? Come on, take heart. Why? Because God is going to bring us through. So it's his engagement with God means that he doesn't just give good advice, not just good advice, but it shapes his advice because of God, because the Lord will look after us. Therefore, be of good heart. And we then are called to shape our advice to people and our leadership in situations from what the Lord does. That is the foundation. It means that later on, when they try and make off in the boat, whereas before they hadn't listened to St. Paul in Crete, this time when he says, you let them go in the boat and we've lost, they immediately listen to him because he now has an authority, and they cut the boat adrift. And it means that when at the end, when he gets this great climax, just before dawn, they don't know where he is, they don't know where they are. All they know is that there's a sound of breakers, and the worst thing you could ever have is breakers. All right. Most of the Mediterranean has got a rocky coast. You'd just be smashed and killed. And he says then, he stood up and he said to them, you have been waiting for 14 days. You imagine what it's like. Anybody who's worked a couple of nights right through, 14 days and nights in a boat. Terrible. All at this time you've not eaten anything. I beg you then, eat some food. You need it in order to survive. Not even a hair of your heads will be lost. And after saying this, Paul took some bread, gave thanks to God, and before them he began to eat. And they took heart, and every one of them also ate some food. What a great thing that is. So here's a step on in this leadership. Not only did he say, take heart because the Lord will protect us, but take some food because you need the food to survive. If you're going to drown, you do not need to eat. In my experience, you do not need a big meal just before you start swimming. You need the food to survive on the beach. It's a product of faith that makes this a good strategy. And not only that, you can see his leadership that we need. The leadership, he says, not only do you want to, that's a good thing to do, to eat, to strengthen you. He leads from the front. They're not convinced. He eats. That's what leadership is. He eats. Do not be afraid. We are not afraid. So, and finally, he gives thanks. It's like Jesus at the feeding of the 5,000. He breaks the bread. Forget all those sort of amazing paintings you get on in sort of ancient churches. This is real drama. Right at this point, he stands up and he breaks this bread. God does not just intervene in the sense of we know that we're going to be okay, but God says, I want to intervene in your lives. He virtually has a Eucharist in the middle of the whole thing, you know. God touches them. It's not that God touches Paul and Paul touches them. It's that at this point, Paul brings them before God. I don't think this is a superficial thing to say, but that we have many opportunities to share the gospel at this present time. And after that, he doesn't do any more at all. Because he can't still the storm, he can't get on the beach, he can't do anything like that. He's just called to offer the leadership that he can offer. That's what you're called to do. You're not called to run the country and change the world, but whether it's your own life or whatever it is, you are called to offer yourself leadership, a family leadership, a friendship, or whatever it is. Whether you're talking to somebody about their finances or about their health or about their relationships or whatever it is. I am firm in the Lord. The Lord will take us through, and I want you to be firm in the Lord as well. And what is the result of all that? The result of this is not that the storm is stilled. This is not a walking on the water moment. The storm is not stilled. The storm gets worse. The worst thing is that you hit a sandbank and it just begins to be smashed to pieces, this boat. We thought we were in danger. We thought we might sink, but we at least been hanging on to the boat, and now it is being destroyed. Destroyed enough to produce bits of wood that we finally get to the beach on. And of course there's a bit where the Romans thought they'd kill everybody as well, all the prisoners, because in those days, if you were a Roman guard, you either produce the prisoner or the prisoner's body. And if you didn't produce their body, then you went the same way as the prisoner. And so it made a lot of sense. But again, you see the Roman soldier, the Roman centurion is now on board. He's taken a leadership for St. Paul. He's on board. Now we're going to get on the beach. And the final bit of it is it's not some adventure story. Any work in high seas, in the water, is totally exhausting. The smashing, the waves, 14 days with no sleep. They are dead on the water. And getting bits of the boat, and they will be thrown up. It's not a nice little lagoon. They'll be thrown up on the beach, just like soggy, almost dead lumps. But they are alive. That is an interesting narrative of how God often pulls us through. There was no stilling of the storm. And I've been through things in my life where I have finished up feeling as though I am more dead than alive, but actually I'm showing signs of life, you know? And he brings us through. Friends, let us take heart from this tremendous word from the Lord that God will always bring us through. When people are reaching their natural end of life, it may be that we finish up, as they say, in a greater light and on a further shore. But in this life, God always gets us through. Let us stay close to the Lord and hear what he is saying and make that a foundation for what we do and our attitude. Make it a foundation for the advice that we give and the leadership we give in this community and even within ourselves. And let us bring them to understand that God is with them, not just with us. Come. And we do this in communion. Some people would have said to me already, we shouldn't be doing communion. A lot of people would have said to Paul in that boat, come on, we're about to drown. We don't need you doing all these prayers with all this bread. That's what he does. That's what we do this morning.